And this really begins the rest of our course, as they say. With this week, we have 2 weeks when we're talking about the culture as values approach. And then with the rest of the course, we're basically looking at different ways to think about culture and how those different ways help us conceptualize what culture does in the social world and its connection to society. This week is a rather hot topic and actually somewhat of a controversial topic. If you pick up our reader that we're using for the course, you're basically going to see almost nothing about this culture as values approach, except for the reading that we're doing for this week, which is from Schills, who along with Talcott Parsons was a luminary in mid-20th century sociology. But it's included in this reader in somewhat of a derogatory sense. In other words, this is how sociologists back then used to think about culture. What I'm going to argue this week and next is actually this approach to thinking about values is actually seeing somewhat of a renaissance in culture. So this week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the deep approaches, the theoretical background to this approach, and then some contemporary uses of it. And then next week, we're going to talk about an argument about this approach. In particular, why in the 1980s this one approach completely tanked and basically disappeared for 25, 30 years in sociology. And then a little bit about why it's making a comeback. And then finally some guidelines, if you will, for the rest of your life or your career as a budding sociologist for how and when to think about culture as values. But for this week, we're going to dig in and see what we can make out of this approach. So a couple of headlines here. The outline for this lecture, I'm going to look at Max Weber, and he's really the deep theoretical roots of this approach, and he thinks about values as creating these kind of ethics of life, of the way that life is lived. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what I just call values in the social system. This is really in reference to the Schills reading, where I'll describe how values were thought of in the mid-20th century in sociology. I've said a little bit about this before when I did my whole magnetic pole and compass metaphor, and I'll recap that here. Then I'm going to talk about some very recent research, when we think of values as motivations. I'll say more about that. And then finally, say a few things about this thing we call American values. Now, many of you are probably wondering by now, what's it going to be like, this quiz that we have coming up? It's going to be on Thursday. I'm going to have it, it'll show up on D2L by about Wednesday. And I'll have some very clear instructions for you. And actually, it's really going to be about 2 weeks of the course. So I want to be clear about that before, I think I might have mentioned that it would be 1 week of the course material. I misspoke on that. It's going to be about 2 weeks of the course material. Let me tell you why, because I think this is going to help you. You'll recall that we're going to have a midterm at some point in this course. And by doing these, the midterm will be predominantly true, false, multiple choice, that sort of thing. So by having these quizzes where we cover 2 weeks of material, you have a little better sense of where I'm trying to focus you for that midterm. If you have any questions, please make sure, as always, to email me sooner than later. Don't get to the end of the course and start asking for extra credit and can I redo something. It's always best now to head off problems before they steamroll out of control. Some of you have already been emailing me with some questions about the material of the course. I'll keep it up with those just as much as I can. So let's dig in here. And let me apologize for a second, my trusty cup of coffee, because I trust that if we were in a classroom at the University of Arizona, some of you would be sneaking coffee in. So I'll do the same. The sun's only just coming up still. Okay. Max Weber. If you've taken a sociology class, you've heard of him. If you haven't taken a sociology class, you've actually probably still heard of him. You just didn't know about it. So let me write his name up here again. Max Weber lives in Germany from really the kind of mid-1800s until about 1920. Considered kind of one of the great founders of the discipline of sociology. Actually, at one point in his career, did tour the United States, was somewhat interested in what was going on in the United States, but he was really deeply interested in kind of the economic and political systems of kind of the world broadly understood. He had this long comparative project where he was trying to compare countries and regions of the world and their specific economic and political structures. So that's a real quick background on Max Weber. One important aspect of Max Weber is that he had this phrase which we call methodological individualism. So within sociology, as some of you even pointed out in your post this past week, there's something of a debate about how to go about doing sociology, especially in terms of the way we think about how social structures and individuals create things or cause things to happen in the social world. Max Weber was the foremost proponent of this idea of methodological individualism, which in short basically said that to understand society and social actions, so to understand what happens out there in the social world, we have to have some sense of what the meaning is inside people's heads, actual individuals' heads. We have to have some sense of what the intent is in their actions in order to understand what we see of their actions. Now this is controversial because what we're trying to do is in some ways get into people's heads, but Weber's way of doing this was to actually look at action that was occurring in the social world, look at people's ideas or the ideas that were connected with action, and by looking at those to be able to kind of backtrack and see what it is inside of individuals that's causing them to do these things. So controversial, but nonetheless an important concept. So he's the founder of what we call this methodological individualism. And this shouldn't be too much of a surprise for you, but then this sort of approach is what we would call an interpretive approach to looking at sociology in the social world. What this means is, as we discovered with the Clifford Geertz reading last week, is we're not just looking at things in the social world and recording. Okay, oh, Professor Adler took a sip of his coffee. Okay, oh, that student, they took notes. Oh, that student there is falling asleep. No, what Weber and what people like Geertz argue is that we're actually going to try and kind of get into what the motives are for the things that people do. And not just in an individualistic way in the terms of we're all different, we all have different motives, but to actually see patterns between people, but to realize that at the end of the day, if we can't trace back some sort of motive or intent inside of individual actors, then we can't make sense of the social world that we're observing. At least these are the arguments of Weber, right? This is a controversial position within sociology, but a very important one for this topic of culture as values. Now he had a well-known German word for this interpretive sociology, and let me write it here because it's a good one for you to see, and you'll sometimes hear people saying this. It's called the Verstehen approach to sociology, V-E-R-S-T-E-H-E-N. So this interpretive, really focused on meaning, in particular, kind of motive and intent within individual social actors. Now recall that one of Max Weber's most important contributions in sociology was this long reflection on how rationality arises within within societies in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and what that rationality does to those of us humans who inhabit particularly Western societies. Weber had different ways of thinking about rationality, and I'm just going to point two of them out to you. One is what we call means-ends rationality, or utilitarian rationality. And this you can think of if we wanted to climb Mount Everest as a group, we would say, okay, that's a very utilitarian goal. We know we can or cannot accomplish that. So if we get to the top of Mount Everest, we know we accomplished it. If we didn't get there, we didn't accomplish it. And then we would select some very kind of rule-based, clear, cut and dry means to get there. All right, we're gonna go through some physical training. We're gonna get our supplies together. We're gonna hire Sherpas. We're gonna get our visas. We're gonna do some training climbs. We're gonna try and learn how to go over crevasses. You get the point. You have some very kind of clear connect the dots to get to kind of this end. Another concept of rationality that Weber talked about is what we would call value rationality. Now, what he meant by this, and he usually used this concept of value rationality when he was talking about religious groups, or when he was talking about social groups that were not seamlessly fitting in to late 1800s bureaucratic capitalist Western society. So he was intrigued by, well, what is it about these groups of people that cause them to kind of live in a different way, to approach the world in a different way? And he argued that they lived through value rationality, which is they had this kind of somewhat vague conception of the telos. That's a Greek word, T-E-L-O-S, which means kind of the end point of action or the end point of living. And that value that was somewhat vague and somewhat abstract, to kind of get to that value, these groups or these persons would develop these ways of living that weren't kind of like a very specific means of set steps to get to that end, but were kind of these general tendencies about how to not only get to that end, but make it seem as if we're, and actually be fully committed to that end through all the steps that we take to get there. So in other words, it's not anything goes, but instead it's living as if we're fully believing in that end, and that's what we want. And when I say end, I mean purpose, I mean goal, okay, and an end of life. An example of this might be if we as a group of sociology students had as a value to create justice in the world. Well, you know, that's kind of abstract, that's kind of vague, but we might live in such a way that we could get to that. For example, we might think, well, then we should kind of develop our minds. We should be critical of the social world around us. We should be oriented to the way power works in the world. And all of a sudden we see that we're kind of sociologists. We're part of this value rational project because we have this telos, this end, this goal, and we're kind of developing, there's no kind of clear set way like climbing Mount Everest to get to that, so we're kind of developing tendencies and kind of behaviors that we think will get us to that, and we kind of never quite get there. That's important. We never quite get there in this life, but also these things that we do will kind of give off evidence to the world around us that that is what we're committed to, that end product is what we're committed to. So let me pause here really quick, and then what I'm going to take you to is to a classic idea of Weber's, in which he tells us how ideas work in society, and this is crucial for our argument here of culture as values. I'll be right back.